I've lived in this neighborhood for 5 years now. It's a quiet place, a sleepy suburban corner where everyone knows each other's names but rarely gets too involved in anyone's life. It's peaceful, uneventful, or at least that's what I thought until a month ago. Every evening, I sit by my window. I don't know how it became a habit, but after dinner, I'd settle down in my old armchair and watch the street. There wasn't much to see. Just kids riding their bikes, neighbors walking their dogs, or the occasional car driving by. It was mundane, a soothing part of my routine. That is, until I started noticing something odd about the house across the street. It's been abandoned for years, since before I even moved in. The yard is overgrown, and the paint on the shutters is chipped and peeling. No one talks about it, and I've never seen anyone go in or out. But last month, that changed. It started with just a flicker of movement in the window. I thought I was imagining things at first. A trick of the light or my eyes playing games with me after a long day at work. But no, there was definitely something there. The first night, I saw a shadowy figure standing behind the curtain. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. I stared back, trying to make out any details. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothing. But it was too far to tell for sure. After a few minutes, the figure melted back into the shadows, and the house looked empty again. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a squatter. Maybe a stray animal casting weird shadows. I shrugged it off. The next night, I saw them again. Same spot, same stillness. Only this time, I could swear there were 2 figures. Each night after that, there were more. It's hard to explain how unsettling it was. The figures never moved. They just stood there, in the same spot by the window, watching the street. Every night, there seemed to be more of them, like they were multiplying. I tried asking my neighbors about it. Most of them just waved me off, said I was probably seeing things, or that it was just kids messing around. But I could see in their eyes that they were uneasy too. Some of them wouldn't even look at the house when I pointed it out. As the days passed, I started to lose sleep. I couldn't get the image of those shadowy figures out of my head. I stopped sitting by the window, but that didn't help either. I could feel them even when I wasn't looking. Their presence clung to the air, thick and suffocating. 2 weeks ago, I decided to confront it. It was late, maybe around midnight. The street was silent, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant hum of a passing car. I grabbed a flashlight and crossed the road, heart pounding in my chest. Standing at the edge of the property, I shone my light up at the window. My breath caught in my throat. There were at least a dozen figures now, their faces hidden in shadow, standing impossibly still. They didn't react to the light, didn't move or flinch. They just watched me. My hands shook as I tried to muster the courage to take a step closer. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just inside the front door. They were closer than the others, clearer. Their face was pale, almost luminous in the darkness. And they were smiling. I turned and ran. Since that night, I've tried to avoid even looking at the house. But I can't help it. It's like it's pulling me in, demanding my attention. And now, something even stranger is happening. The figures are leaving. I noticed it a few days ago. One of them, the one closest to the door, was no longer in the window. The next night, 2 more were gone. It's as if they're moving, creeping out of the house. I haven't seen them on the street, but I can feel them. They're out there somewhere watching. Yesterday, I found muddy footprints leading from the front steps of the house to the street. They stopped right in front of my driveway. I don't know what's happening, but I'm terrified. I don't sleep anymore, not really. I just lie in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of my old house, waiting for something. I don't know what, but I can feel it coming. And tonight, as I write this, I've realized something. The window is empty. There's no one left inside. But when I looked out my window a few minutes ago, I saw a figure standing on my lawn. They're closer now. I didn't move from my chair for what felt like hours. My hands gripped the sides of the armrests so tightly. My knuckles were white, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure on my lawn. The shape was familiar, though I couldn't make out any features from the distance or the dim light. It was just standing there, staring at me. I don't know how long I sat frozen, watching it. Time seemed to lose its meaning. My mind stuck in a loop of fear and confusion. But I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for it to get closer. I finally managed to pull myself out of the chair, my legs shaky, and I fumbled for my phone. I wanted to call the police, but something stopped me. What could I even say? Hi! There's a shadowy figure standing on my lawn that I think came from the abandoned house across the street. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight again. My hands were trembling so hard it took a few tries to switch it on. I crept to the window, hoping the thin glass would still feel like a barrier between me and whatever was out there. The beam of light wobbled as I aimed it at the figure. For a second, I thought it would vanish, like some figment of my imagination that would dissolve under the harshness of reality. But it didn't. It just stood there, its face still hidden in shadow, head slightly tilted, like it was curious about me. I shined the light directly at it, trying to get a better look at its face, but the shadows seemed to cling to it, refusing to reveal anything. But something was wrong. The longer I stared, the more I realized this figure was too still. Not like a person frozen in fear or indecision, but unnaturally still, like it wasn't even alive. A gust of wind blew through the trees, and that's when I saw it. The figure's clothes moved, rustling softly in the breeze, but the figure itself didn't move at all, not even a twitch. I stumbled back from the window, heart racing. What was it? Was it some kind of trick? A mannequin? But no, that didn't make sense. The figures in the house had moved. I'd seen them multiply, change, leave. This thing on my lawn was real, alive, somehow connected to whatever was happening in that house. I felt a creeping sense of dread as I realized I had no idea how many of them had left the house. I had been so focused on the figures in the window that I hadn't been paying attention to what was happening on the street, in the shadows around my own home. I flicked the flashlight off and pulled back from the window, retreating to the safety of my living room. My brain was screaming at me to lock the doors, but another part of me, a more desperate part, was convinced that locks wouldn't help. I wasn't safe. I don't know how, but I knew they were inside my house. I could feel them, watching, waiting. It was as if the walls were breathing, their presence thick in the air around me, making it hard to catch my breath. My skin prickled, every hair on my body standing on end. I turned in slow circles, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but nothing seemed out of place. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible creak from the hallway. My blood ran cold. I hadn't moved from the living room, and I'd been the only one home. Or at least I thought I had been. Swallowing the rising panic, I forced myself to move toward the sound, one foot dragging in front of the other. Each step felt like I was walking deeper into my own nightmare. The hallway stretched out before me, unnaturally long, the door at the end standing ajar. I don't remember leaving it open. The creaking sound came again, closer now. I raised my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The light wavered as I approached the door. My hand hesitated on the knob, and I paused for a long moment, trying to summon the courage to push it open. Part of me wanted to turn around and run, but I knew deep down that running wouldn't help. There was nowhere to run to. Finally, I shoved the door open, flashlight cutting into the room. It was empty, my spare bedroom, undisturbed, just as I had left it. For a moment, I let out a sigh of relief. Maybe I was just losing it. Something shifted in the corner of the room. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but my flashlight caught it. There, just behind the wardrobe, was a figure. Small, almost childlike, hunched over as if trying to stay out of sight. But it hadn't moved fast enough. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, the figure straightened, revealing its full height. It was one of them, the same dark shape from the house. And now it was in my house. It stood perfectly still, just like the ones I'd seen in the window. But this one felt different, closer, more real. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. For a second, I thought about running, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was trapped in that horrible moment, with no idea what to do. Then the figure moved, took one slow, deliberate step toward me, and for the first time I heard it. A low, whispering sound, like a breath caught in the back of its throat. I couldn't make out the words, but they chilled me to the bone. I backed out of the room, not daring to take my eyes off it. Every inch of me screamed to turn and run, but something told me that if I did, I wouldn't make it. As I reached the hallway, I heard another creak, and then another. They were coming. I slammed the door shut and bolted down the hall, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The air in the house had grown suffocating, thick with a presence I couldn't escape. But where could I go? As I rounded the corner into the living room, I caught a glimpse out of the window. More figures, lining the street, standing motionless in front of the house. They were closing in. And then, as if from nowhere, a soft knock echoed from my front door. The knock was soft, almost polite, but in the dead silence of my house, it sounded like a gunshot. My blood turned to ice. I stared at the front door, heart hammering in my chest, and for a moment, I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that I was imagining it. But then it came again. Asterisk knock. 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 Asterisk. Slow. Steady. Like whoever or whatever was on the other side wasn't in any hurry. It knew I wasn't going anywhere. I backed away from the door, my pulse thudding in my ears, eyes darting around the room for something, anything, that could protect me. I thought about grabbing a knife from the kitchen, but what good would it do against them? Against this? Another knock, and then I heard it, a voice, low, muffled through the door, but unmistakable. Let us in. I froze. The voice didn't sound threatening. It sounded calm, friendly almost, but that only made it worse. My instincts screamed at me not to respond, not to acknowledge that I'd heard it, but my mind was reeling. Who, what was out there? How many of them? And why did they want to get in? Let us in, the voice repeated, a little louder this time, almost coaxing. It was a woman's voice, soft, gentle. We won't hurt you. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a bead of cold sweat run down my spine. Asterisk, don't believe it. Don't believe it. Asterisk. I turned, ready to bolt for the back door, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around, my heart leaping into my throat. In the corner of the living room, just beyond the glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds, I saw it. A figure standing perfectly still, blending into the shadows. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. Another one of them had gotten in. I stared at it, willing it to disappear, but it didn't. It was tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its face was a blur of darkness, features impossible to make out. I could just barely see the outline of its body, long and thin, with arms that hung unnaturally low, fingers brushing the floor. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "Let us in," the voice at the door said again. This time it wasn't alone. More voices joined in, whispering in unison. "Let us in, let us in." I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran down the hallway, my feet pounding against the floor. The house seemed to stretch and warp around me, the walls narrowing as I sprinted toward the back door. I could hear them now, the creaking of the floorboards behind me, the low, raspy whispers that seemed to follow me through the air. I burst into the kitchen, skidding to a stop in front of the back door. My hand fumbled with the lock, heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were louder now, like they were right behind me. "Let us in." I threw the door open and stumbled out into the backyard. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't stop to catch my breath. I sprinted across the lawn, past the tall wooden fence, and into the alley that ran behind the houses. The street was dark and empty, but I could feel them. I didn't need to see them to know they were there. They were everywhere now. I kept running, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't dare slow down. I didn't know where I was going, just away, as far away from that house, those things as I could get. But as I rounded the corner at the end of the alley, I stopped dead in my tracks. They were waiting for me, at least half a dozen figures, standing in a line across the street, their faces hidden in shadow. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there watching. And behind them, scattered throughout the neighborhood, I saw more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, silent, motionless. And then I heard it again, that soft, gentle voice. "You can't run from us." My breath hitched in my throat. I took a step back, then another, but there was nowhere to go. They were everywhere. The figures closest to me began to move, stepping forward in perfect unison. Their footsteps made no sound. Their presence was suffocating, oppressive, like a wave of darkness rolling toward me. I turned, ready to run back the way I came, but stopped when I saw them. More figures, closing in from behind, their dark shapes blending into the night. They were surrounding me, trapped. I stumbled back, heart racing, my mind scrambling for a way out, but there was none. I was cornered, alone with no one to help me. The figures stopped a few feet away, forming a perfect circle around me. Their faces were still hidden, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, unforgiving. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my body frozen in place. I was paralyzed by fear, and then, as if on cue, the circle parted. One figure stepped forward, taller than the rest, its movements slow and deliberate. Came closer, and for the first time I could see its face. It was me. I stared in horror as the figure approached, its face a perfect reflection of mine, but twisted, distorted. The eyes were too dark, too hollow, and the mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. It stopped inches away from me, that awful grin widening. "We've been waiting for you," it whispered, its voice an eerie echo of mine. "You belong with us now." The other figures began to close in, their whispering voices rising in a haunting chorus. "Let us in, let us in." I stumbled back, shaking my head, trying to deny what was happening, but I couldn't escape. They were everywhere, and as they closed in, I knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The circle tightened around me, the whispers growing louder, but still too soft to understand. My heart pounded so hard, I thought my chest might explode. They were close now, close enough that I could hear the faint rustling of their clothes, the subtle creak of their limbs as they moved. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, something oppressive, almost suffocating, like the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. I stepped back, my legs shaking, but there was nowhere to go. The figure that looked like me, the twisted, grinning version of myself, was standing so close I could almost feel its breath on my skin. It tilted its head, watching me with dark, empty eyes. "You're one of us?" it whispered, voice low and intimate, as if sharing a secret. "You always were." I shook my head, taking another stumbling step back. The ground felt uneven beneath my feet, like the whole world was tilting, shifting. I tried to speak, to say anything, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight, my mouth dry, couldn't breathe. And then, without warning, the figure lunged at me. I stumbled back, my hands flying up to defend myself, but it didn't touch me. Instead, it passed through me, no, into me. A cold, numbing sensation washed over me, spreading from my chest to my limbs, freezing me in place. My breath hitched as I felt something alien, something dark, winding its way inside me, burrowing deep into my bones. The other figures watched in eerie silence, their faces still hidden, but I could feel their eyes on me. They were waiting for something to happen, for me to change. I gasped, struggling to stay upright as the cold spread through my veins, filling me with a terrible, suffocating weight. My limbs felt heavy, like they didn't belong to me anymore. My vision blurred, the world tilting in and out of focus. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, clearer. "Join us." I tried to fight it, but the cold was inside me now, growing stronger with every passing second. I could feel it taking hold, sinking its claws into my mind, my thoughts. A horrible dread washed over me as I realized what was happening. They weren't just trying to surround me, they were trying to make me one of them. I staggered back, my hands clutching at my chest as if I could somehow pull the cold out of me, tear it free. But it was no use. It was spreading too fast. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The figures moved closer, their whispering voices filling my ears, swirling around me like a vortex of sound. "Let us in. Let us in." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, trying to block out the overwhelming sensation that I was slipping away, that I was losing myself. My own heartbeat felt distant, muffled. My thoughts were growing foggy, scattered. I could feel something else inside me now, something that wasn't me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the cold stopped. I opened my eyes, blinking in confusion. The figures were still there, standing in a perfect circle around me. But they weren't moving. They weren't whispering anymore. They just stood there watching. I struggled to my feet, my limbs heavy and uncooperative, but I managed to stand. My breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, I just stood there, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The figures didn't move. They just watched me. I took a hesitant step forward, half expecting them to lunge at me, to finish what they'd started. But they remained still like statues. My heart raced in my chest as I took another step, and then another. I was walking through the circle now, and none of them made a move to stop me. Something wasn't right. I looked down at my hands, my fingers trembling, and for a split second, I didn't recognize them. They looked different, pale, almost translucent. I blinked and they were normal again, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I kept walking, moving through the circle of figures, my eyes flicking from one to the next, waiting for them to do something. Asterisk anything star. But they just stood there, silent and still. I didn't understand. Why weren't they stopping me? Why weren't they chasing me? I turned around, my eyes scanning the street, the alley, the rows of dark houses that lined the neighborhood. Everything was quiet now. Too quiet. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as I moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was coming from behind me. I turned, my heart in my throat, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figures had changed. They were no longer standing still. They were dissolving, fading. Their dark shapes were melting into the shadows, like smoke dissipating into the air. One by one, they vanished, until there was nothing left but the empty street and the whispering wind. For a brief, dizzying moment, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe they had given up. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true, because as I stood there, alone on the empty street, I realized something terrible. The cold inside me hadn't gone away. It was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. And as I stared down at my hands again, I saw it. Asterisk really asterisk saw it this time. My skin was changing. It was turning pale, almost translucent, just like the figures I had seen before. My fingers twitched, moving of their own accord, and for a horrifying second, I felt like I wasn't in control anymore, like something else was moving me. And then, in the distance, I saw them, more figures standing at the edge of the street, watching, waiting. I wasn't free. I was one of them now. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't free. I never had been. All this time, I thought I was running from them, escaping their grasp, but they'd already gotten to me. The cold, the whispering, the strange stillness in my limbs. It was all part of their plan. And now, standing alone on that dark, empty street, I could feel it more clearly than ever. I was changing. I looked down at my hands again, heart pounding in my chest, but the skin was no longer pale. It was turning dark. A shadow was creeping up my arms, twisting and swirling beneath my skin like ink in water, spreading with every breath I took. My fingers twitched uncontrollably, bending and curling in ways they shouldn't, like they had a mind of their own. Panic clawed at my throat, but there was no one to help me, no one to hear me. The figures at the edge of the street, the ones I thought had disappeared, were still there. They hadn't moved, but their presence loomed over me, heavy and suffocating. I could feel their eyes on me, watching as the transformation took hold. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air. My skin prickled, the dark tendrils winding up my arms and legs, coiling tighter and tighter. I could feel it spreading through me, rooting itself in every part of my body. My chest tightened, my lungs burning as I struggled to breathe. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. My voice, it wasn't mine anymore. I looked down again, horrified at what I saw. My hands were no longer my own. They had become long, slender, and unnaturally twisted, just like their hands. My skin, once warm and familiar, was now cold and lifeless, a dark, shifting mass that writhed with every movement. I'm becoming one of them. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing, searching for some way, any way, to stop what was happening. But I already knew it was too late. The cold had taken hold. The darkness was inside me now, gnawing away at what little was left of me. The figures were closer now. They were no longer standing still, no longer waiting in the shadows. They were moving, slowly at first, but with each passing second, their steps became more deliberate, more purposeful. They were coming for me, and as they approached, something terrible occurred to me. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I should have been terrified, but the fear I'd been drowning in for so long was fading, slipping away like sand through my fingers. Instead, a strange, hollow calm was taking its place. It was as if my body, my mind, had finally given in. I couldn't fight them anymore. I didn't want to. The figures were close enough now that I could see them clearly. Their faces were blank, featureless shadows, but I could feel their presence like a weight pressing down on me. They didn't speak, but I could hear them, whispering in my mind, their voices soft and insistent. "Come with us." I backed away, my heart thudding in my chest, but my body was sluggish, heavy. I could barely move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as though the shadows were pulling me down, dragging me into the darkness with them. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling, though it no longer felt like mine. "Please, no." But it was useless. I was already theirs. I felt something stir behind me. Another presence, cold and familiar. Slowly, I turned. It was me again. The twisted, grinning version of myself stood just inches away, its dark eyes gleaming with something like triumph. It reached out, its cold, shadowy fingers brushing against my skin, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me. "We've been waiting," it whispered, voice like ice. "And now you're finally home." I tried to pull away, but I couldn't. My limbs were stiff, unresponsive, as if they no longer belonged to me. The darkness that had been creeping up my arms was now spreading faster, consuming me completely. My vision blurred, the world around me fading into shadows. I was disappearing. The twisted version of me stepped closer, its grin widening, and in that moment, I understood. I was never running from them. I was running to them. I had been part of this all along. The figures in the house, the ones that had slowly multiplied, they were just like me. People who had once lived normal lives, people who had fought the change until they couldn't anymore. And now it was my turn. I was joining them, becoming one of the shadows, one of the watchers. The figures closed in, surrounding me on all sides, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Let us in. Let us in." I felt my body shift, the last remnants of my humanity slipping away. My vision darkened, the cold overtaking me completely. And then, as the last bit of me faded into the shadows, I understood what they had been whispering all along. They weren't asking to be let in. They were telling me to let go, to stop fighting. And so I did. I let the darkness take me, let it consume me, until I was nothing more than a shadow, standing silently among the others, watching, waiting, just like they had. Because now, when the next person looks out their window, they won't see an empty street. They'll see me, standing there, waiting for them to join us.